Well, we welcome you to our webinar this morning, part 2 in our series on building hybrid cloud applications. Today we're going to be going over the topic building a front end in Angular. And our presentation today is going to be handled by me, Oliver Nelson, along with two of our developers, Aaron Gulak and Gavin Hogan. In part 1 of this webinar, we focused on setting up a Thriftly API. Now, Thriftly makes the development and deployment of APIs trivially easy to accomplish. You can get an API running in any of the supported programming languages that we have in just a matter of minutes. It's a very simple process. And this API can be instantly served on the internet right from your development machine, making the prototyping process especially easy. Development is so fast in part because of this concept built into Thriftly related to having functions as APIs. This concept allows you to reuse your existing code base, to leverage your existing code base to build APIs quickly and easily. This simple interface that we have extends into the area of security as well. Thriftly makes adding login functions and session style validation using JWTs very easy to do. Additionally, Thriftly includes access to our gateways, which come with all of the Thriftly subscriptions. And with these gateways, you're able to publish your API without having to fiddle with firewalls or port forwarding or DMZs or any of that sort of stuff. An API can be made public on the internet using our secure tunneling technology without having to do any network configuration, which is a big advantage when you go to deploy this at customer sites, all of which may have slightly different setups. And you're able to not only get access to that secure tunnel, but also our Thriftly gateways serve your API over HTTPS. So you get a secure endpoint for your API as well. In that first webinar that we did in this series, Tony used the property tracker demo as the basis for showing off some of these features. And one of the keys to this setup is the variability that it allows in how applications can be architected and run. For instance, many ISVs have applications that are locally installed and hosted on their customers' networks. In most cases, these applications have been around longer than the cloud. And that's just how applications were installed before we had the cloud as an option. That's how it was done. ISV would sell an application to a customer, install it on a network server, and everyone from the network would access that server. But to bring an application into the cloud in a controlled manner while also allowing the customer to hold on to the data, which in many cases they're very interested in doing, well, that can complicate things quite a bit. But Thriftly makes this easy by allowing this hybrid model that we're showing here, where parts of the application, especially the data itself, can remain on premises while other parts of the application are based in the cloud. This hybrid architecture is pretty powerful, and it works very well with Angular, as you'll see throughout our webinar today, but it also works with other front ends as well. One of the things that we found about this setup, and with the idea in general of using a web front end, is that many developers are worried that the complexity or size or interface of their application prevents them from taking this approach. So I thought I'd briefly address some of these concerns before we get into the main portion of our demo today. One that we hear quite often, one concern we hear quite often is that converting these huge Windows applications into web applications is going to take years to do. And using the classical methods and tools available, very often that would be the case. But we found that this is quite different in practice for two reasons when you're using Thriftly. One is that it makes the development cycle so much faster by allowing that code reuse, leveraging existing code. and it removes all of the work that would normally go into building a multi-threaded application server where you have to deal with the protocol that you want to serve and how you're handling the life cycle of your application, things like that. All of that is dealt with by Thriftly. And secondly, the other piece of this that we think is important is that rarely does the entire application need to end up as a web application. Quite often, you can get a very high return on investment by choosing the most critical parts of your application that will benefit from having a web or mobile front end. You don't have to build everything at once, and you may find that there are pieces of your application that never need to be converted to a mobile version. They can remain a desktop version. And that kind of leads us to the second claim that we see often. This claim overlooks an important aspect of web development. Windows applications have almost always had an inherent limitation to them, and that's the Windows controls that those applications use. Although you could turn to third-party controls, and developers have often done this, you're still limited in what you can build. In comparison, the web is a blank canvas. You can have modal support, MDIs using tab pages, tree views. All of those things are possible on the web. But more importantly, things that weren't easy to do in Windows applications are trivial to accomplish on the web. If a visual representation of something is best, well, that's what you build. An interactive map instead of using field entries, well, that's easy to do, no problem. A configurable dashboard with real-time graphs, again, fairly simple thing to do on the web. Even if, excuse me, even if you need a global fuzzy search that brings in data from all over your system and uses different row layouts for the different types of data, well, mashups are one of the things that the web is great at from that standpoint. The point is, using tools like Thriftly and Angular aren't meant to hamstring you. They're meant to open things up, and we feel that Angular and Thriftly do this with aplomb. There's one more claim that we wanted to address before we get into our Angular demo, though. And this one comes up in some industries more than others. Accounting, medical often have these users that have pretty amazing levels of muscle memory related keyboard shortcuts. There are some third-party modules that are available for Angular that allow keyboard shortcuts in your web application. As long as the shortcuts that you're using aren't ones that are already taken by the browser itself or the operating system, you're able to keep those same shortcuts that your users have known for so very long. And when you combine this sort of battle-tested optimization with some of the new optimizations that really only work well on the web, such as things like AI-driven autocomplete or system-wide global search, you can actually end up with a data entry system that is faster than what you had in your Windows application. This idea of a new user interface paradigm is important on the web. But let's bring things back to earth a little bit here and talk about how Angular works with all of this. The structure of an Angular application is going to end up sounding familiar to most of us by the time we're done. We're going to learn what directives are, components, services, and we're going to start by defining exactly what Angular is. And Aaron is going to go through the pieces that make up an Angular application, and he'll relate them to some concepts that you already are familiar with. After that, Gavin is going to show us around a simple Angular application from the perspective of a front-end developer. Then we'll turn things back over to Aaron to review some of the tools that are commonly used in developing Angular applications. And also, we're going to review how Thriftly fits into this Angular landscape. And finally, we'll let you know what's coming in part 3 of this webinar series. So let's go ahead and get things underway by turning this over to Aaron, who will take us through Angular.
All right. All right, as Oliver said, my name's Aaron, and I'm going to be talking a bit about Angular today, give you a little warm-up on it before we see Gavin take it into action. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Angular is a modern JavaScript framework, and it's used to build scalable and robust single-page applications. Single-page application is a pretty common thing in the JavaScript framework department. What it is essentially is, instead of having a traditional web app where you would transition from one HTML page to another, reloading all your dependencies as you do that, what a single page application does is it uses logic to determine when to dynamically insert HTML into one HTML page. So what that does is it allows for faster transitions between views and overall gives you a smoother feel. So Angular does a really good job at providing the functionality needed to build these applications. And this isn't the only framework that does this. There's a lot of other modern ones, and we'll touch on a couple of them briefly at the end. But Angular is a really good framework to use for this. Some reasons why we like it is it's one of the big leaders in the community. It's been around for almost 10 years, which, if you know anything about the JavaScript world, is quite a long time. So it's been battle tested in that regard. In fact, about 3 years ago, they did a pretty big upgrade that really fixed a lot of the concerns they had found along the way, optimized things a lot. So they really have spent a lot of time making a really good framework. Because it's been around for so long, of course, there's also a huge community for it. So there's a ton of documentation available. There's a ton of resources, whether it's tutorials, plugins, extensions, whatever you need. There's a ton of that out there to make Angular development quick and easy. So how does Angular work? Well, what it does essentially is it takes a root element on your HTML page and it bootstraps itself to that element. Once it bootstraps itself to that element, it now controls pretty much the entire web app. So it can handle routing, it can handle changing views, it can handle user interactions, whether it's clicking a button or clicking a link. It kind of takes care of all of that. So what does this Angular ecosystem look like? This is a bit of a zoomed out glance of Angular here, and I'm going to go into these pieces later on in the presentation, but I wanted to kind of show you overall what's happening. So as you can see, we have our external API up on the top, and then inside of that module is essentially this Angular ecosystem that I was talking about. So a module is the jumping off point of Angular. What that is essentially is a way to contextually organize your code, usually based on features or something like that. But Angular always will have one root module, and that's what it uses to bootstrap your app and get things going. So the nice thing about modules is, like I said, you can organize your features that way, but then they can also easily be exported and imported, and it really makes for a nicely organized application when you're building it that way. All right, so let's go in a little bit to the actual meat and potatoes of Angular here. First thing we're going to talk about is components. Components are kind of the main way that Angular works. And what they are is they're custom web components or elements. So when you're building HTML, you see header tags, you see paragraph tags. What you're essentially doing with a component is building your own custom element. So this can be as simple as just a custom input that validates your data, but it can also be as complicated as a table that has infinite scrolling, custom sorting, and dynamic filtering. So these components can get really complex and really let you reuse complicated pieces of code and also do some pretty cool things that we'll see when Gavin starts working on it. So really the main point, as you can see by this diagram for components, is it's all about the data and communicating the data from wherever you're getting it from the API and displaying that to the user. So how that works is a component is broken into a class, which is just a basic JavaScript class, and that contains your properties and your bindings as you see them fit. Then you have your HTML template that's bound to that class, and in there you're going to have those properties inserted into the HTML. And you can have a lot of different communication between your template and your class. You can bind user events, like I said, clicking on a button, submitting a form. You can also have property binding, which is the data bound to the HTML. The last piece of a component is a style sheet, which is just usually CSS, but the cool thing about that with Angular is the CSS is actually scoped to your component specifically. So CSS usually works very globally where it will affect your entire app. Doing it in these components, you can really isolate your stylings and have a very custom experience. So that's pretty cool. So here we see kind of how we get the data and display it to the user. But first, we need to actually have that data available to use it. So how do we do that? That comes in with the use of services. So a service, again, is just a JavaScript class that has some metadata attached to it to let Angular know what it's doing. But essentially what you can do with a service is create a custom kind of front-end API that can then be injected anywhere into your app. So you can inject it into a component, you can inject it into another service even, you can direct it into inject it into a directive or a filter, which we'll talk about those in a minute. So a lot of times, what this is used for is to actually communicate with an API, like a Thriftly one, for example. So what that does is the service is able to hide a lot of this complexity involved in API integration. Anyone who's ever integrated with an API knows there can be a lot of custom stuff required for that. They can have different kinds of session management, whether it's JWT tokens or cookies. There can be custom endpoints. Pretty much anytime you're integrating an API, you're going to have some of that custom logic. So instead of having to account for that logic every time you perform a call, which is going to be a lot in an app, you can put it all into this service, and then this service can be injected anywhere you need it. And the service does a great job of hiding those complexities. So you can reuse this service throughout the app, hide the complexities, and then API calls are very simple from there. So essentially the process here, combining the components with the services, is you would have your component call your service would then perform any logic, set up the API call, take that data and send it to the API. The API would then receive the data, do what it needs to with it, send it back to the service. The service can then take that data, whether it's in JSON format, XML format, even binary format, and it can parse it for you into JSON and send it back to the component. That way, the component, all it has to do is worry about what to do with the data. It doesn't have to worry about anything else. So as you can see, this works really well to build a nice logical web app. So the final thing I want to talk about are these directives and filters. So we've already talked about components that kind of do all the plumbing work, and we talked about services which retrieve the data. But once we actually have the data and it's displayed to the user, there's a lot of different things that we need to do with that data. For one, we might need to filter the data. So oftentimes we want to display currencies to the user or formatted dates, and the data that we get back from our API isn't always formatted that way. For example, like I said, a currency can just be a number sometimes. So with filters, what you can do is you attach these filters in the HTML, bind them to the data, and essentially you can pass it through a function that transforms your data and spits it back out to be displayed to the user. So like I said, we can format currencies, we can format dates, numbers, and you can even write custom filters too, which work really well for, let's say, code type mapping. All that can be handled quickly and easily with these simple functions. Another thing that's a little more complex than filters is dealing with user gestures. So sometimes a user, for example, is filling out a form, and we need to validate that data. Well, Angular using directives gives us a nice, easy way to do that. These directives, they are kind of like components, except instead of being custom elements themselves, they attach themselves to elements. And by attaching themselves to the elements, they're able to trap user events, they can manipulate the HTML DOM, add classes to elements, hide and show elements, repeat elements, and all of this is based logically on the data that you're dealing with. So I've kind of shown you now the little pieces real quickly on them. And they all work, as I said, together really well with this data to make a nice web app. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Gavin and let him show you how he does it.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Gavin, and I'm going to be talking about how we can use the Angular framework to kind of interact with these different API endpoints that we provide. Thriftly. And the one that we're going to be using today is the Property Tracker API. And so I just wanted to go through a quick overview of the demo that we're going to be looking at in a little bit more detail. And with the Property Tracker API, we can pull up a list of locations, and we have that represented here with the table. That gives a brief overview about the locations. And so we can kind of click on here on one of them and see a little bit more detail about the location that we didn't see on the table, like a couple values or numerical values regarding the location, and a description, some save and delete functionality. And there's items also associated with the location. So in this case, we only have one of them. We can kind of go into it and see that it's similar to how the location details view was set up as well, with save and delete functionality. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail. But first, I wanted to talk about how an Angular project is configured from the ground up to get started. And that's handled by a tool that Angular provides called the Angular CLI, and that stands for the command line interface. And so the command line interface handles generating these different kind of components and services, but most importantly, you can use it to generate the entire foundation of your Angular project. And so if we take a look at the file explorer here, we can see that I have some folders in here that I've developed on and added to this project as I've been developing in it. But the Angular CLI can provide all these other boilerplate files that you would have to spend a lot of time configuring yourself in the first place without using it. And so that's a really powerful tool. It takes maybe a minute to generate all these things and make its own routing file. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the configuration files that I wanted to talk about specifically are the angular.json and the package.json files. And so the angular.json file handles a lot more of the fine-tuning configuration that you'd want to do with your project, as far as maybe where your entry points for your TypeScript files are to handle the bootstrapping process like Aaron was talking about previously, or where you can give it information as to where you're going to be storing your static assets like images or fonts, and what kind of style sheets you're going to be using and where the style sheets are located. And so your project has an idea of where all this information is through this Angular JSON file. And the second part that I wanted to cover is the package.json. And the package.json handles all your third-party integrations and library integrations that you're going to be using, and dependencies that you'll have. And just from the Angular CLI command of generating a new project, you get about 95% of what you're seeing here. I think I've added in maybe one or two libraries like Bootstrap or ng Bootstrap as well. And so, but other than that, it really provides everything you need from Angular, everything Angular depends on from just a foundational level. And it lets you be able to, after the CLI is done generating your boilerplate code, you can really just run this ng-serve command and get it started right from there. And so now that we kind of have an understanding of how an Angular project is configured from a kind of a basic level, I wanted to go in and talk about, so what is handling what we see on the web browser? And so we can kind of go into the locations subfolder here and take a look at that page that we were just looking at, which is locations.html. And we can see from the HTML file that some similar stuff that we just saw on the web browser. And we're going to flip back over there in a second. But we see that the headers and table data, we have table rows here that are explicitly defined. And that makes sense. And if we kind of interact with this a little bit, we see that, well, we're not able to view anything regarding the table like we were previously. And I wanted to just highlight some of the built-in features that Angular has to make your HTML files a little bit more dynamic and interactable just from the HTML itself. So something we can do is replace these explicitly defined table rows with some Angular-based code and go through that a little bit and kind of talk about what that's doing. So I'm going to save this, and we can, first, before we go into anything, we can take a look and see, wow. So now we see what we saw in the beginning, and we have 11 different records here, and they're interactable like they were previously. And so let's take a look at what kind of would handle doing that. So we can start off here and see ng4 is one of those directives that Aaron was talking about previously, and this is a built-in directive provided by Angular, and it's used for iterating through multiple pieces that are going to be displayed on something like a table. And so we can see that we're iterating through a list of locations here, referring to each one as a location. And we have an index value here that we can track specific indexes of that array that we're looking through. So if we come down here to the table row, we can see that we have a click directive, and this is also provided by Angular to handle any event handling with that specific element. So this one's handling a click event. And so we take a look down here and we see, okay, well now we're actually defining the rows or the columns that are going to be displayed on the view. And we're referring to these locations, and we see that we have a name, an address, a city, state, zip code, and then we have a total value here, but it's using this keyword currency here. And this is a reference into a filter that like Aaron was talking about previously as well. And to take a look at what it does, we can see that all these values are nice and formatted now. They have the respective currency sign here, and then the appropriate comma placement and decimal placement as well. And that's all handled by about 8 characters of code here that's provided by Angular. It's super powerful. And there's also configuration that you can have as well to handle dynamic and international currencies as well. So it's just not, dollars, US dollars. And to take it out, just to show you how much configuration or styling it adds to the actual value, it's a lot. And so you see that some of the decimal places aren't even defined here, and the Angular just kind of takes care of that with those built-in filters. And so moving forward, something we see here is that we have location, and that makes sense. We can see that we're iterating through the locations, but how do we know what fields are going to be on the location? And we see that we have some already defined here, but where can we refer to see, okay, what makes up a location object? And that's handled by the model files that TypeScript provides you to create. And so here's the location model file that we're using. And we see some of those similar fields that we were referencing to in the HTML, like name and address, city, state, zip code. And so this is great. This is a place for us to create these deterministic, class files for these objects that we're going to be interacting with the API. But how do we know that these locations have these fields? And so that is when we want to kind of turn to the Thriftly documentation for the endpoint. And so we're using the property tracker, and we have the documentation for this. And so we're going to go down to the services and see which service we're currently using. Excuse me. And so we're going to the location service. And so from here, we can see a little bit more information about the location service, some of the calls, the structures, exceptions, and this is error handling. But the structures is what we want to focus on here. And we are looking at a location structure regarding this service. And so this is what we're going to reference when we're building those model files to know what we should be expecting back from the location objects. And it looks similar to the model class or the model file that I was showing previously. And this is where we get all the information and we can build those, so we don't have to continually reference to these. So like I said, it has the name for the fields, the data types, and then if it's a required field for it to be a valid object or not. And so going back, let's flip back over here. We have the model now. We understand what the template is referencing to when we see these specific location fields. And now the missing link is, well, where do we get this information from? What's talking to the location service API here? And so that's handled by services. And like Aaron was mentioning, the services are used to handle a lot of business logic and talking to APIs. And here we can see an example of that, of the search locations call, making a reference to this API service that we have stored in the core service, referencing to the location service, and then making a call to search locations.
Yeah, Gavin, if I could butt in here real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so as Gavin said, this is doing a API call calling this method search locations, which which takes those fields. But you can see, as he said, it's calling another service, this API service. And this is another custom service that Gavin wrote. And what this does is this handles all the API calls. So this is kind of what I was talking about before. And you can kind of see some of the magic here. So Thriftly supports a lot of different protocols. The one we decided to use for this project is JSONRPC. And so you can see like around line 18 there, Gavin is putting in the JSONRPC logic. So he's adding a JSONRPC version number, he's adding an ID, and then passing the method and the parameters in the format that JSONRPC expects. He's also adding the header to say that it's a JSON request, and getting the endpoint as well there. So instead of having to do all this extra code every time you do a call, he can now put the protocol in one place here and handle it all just nice and neat like that. So that's just kind of what I was talking about in action there.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And so, yeah, that kind of gives an idea of how powerful these services are. They're very reusable. You can kind of inject them anywhere you need them. And this core service here regarding the API is something that we use everywhere in the project. But going back to the specific call that we're making here, we see that we're making a specific call to search locations, and we see that there's some parameters here, but how do we know that this parameter is what we need for the call? And this is where we can flip back to the documentation as well and kind of see, well, what calls are provided to us with this service. And so we see, okay, well, we're using search locations here. And then we see that it takes in a parameter of search of a data type of a location search criteria, and it is a required parameter to make a valid call. And it returns an array of locations. So we can take a look and see what this structure is. And I've set this up already to model this. And so we see these are all the fields that we saw in our TypeScript file or in our service just a few seconds ago. And so for the use that we're having for it, we just want the first 11 records. So we can kind of send in nothing here as far as the name, city, state, zip code, country, but we have the page size here. And that documentation just makes it really easy. So you know exactly what you're working with and what exactly the calls take in and if it's what's required or not. And so now that we understand where we would get the model data from in our code base and how we display that model data to the view, we're kind of missing the cohesiveness between the model and the view here. How does the browser know what to display when you go to a specific URL? And so just to take a look at what I'm talking about is we have a URL called locations here, and our Angular project knows, okay, well, we want to display this locations table. But where that's handled in the actual Angular project is going to be in your, let's close out of this. It's going to be in your app routing module. And this is where you set all the routes for your project. And the routes are directly tied to a component. And so the component that we're using when we're on the path of locations is the locations component. And so we can open this up and take a look at what this component looks like. And so we see here that we have this component selector and some of that metadata that Aaron was talking about regarding the template that it's using or the style sheets that it's using. In this case, we see, okay, well, it's using the locations template, and that makes sense that, you know, this component would tie that together with the route, and this is how this template is displayed here. But going to a little bit more detail of what the component will actually do for the template is, so we define the component here, and then we see this line of code that says, you know, implements on init, and this is a reference to something in Angular referred to as the lifecycle hooks of the Angular project. And these are lifecycle hooks that are continuously running while the project is running and while a component is active on the browser. And on init being, I think, the second one in the 10 different lifecycle hooks that Angular has. And on init is one that I find myself using more frequently as a developer because it handles running all of the code that you put inside of it in the component right here before anything's displayed to the view. And so in this case, we want to have these locations nice and ready for the user before the user sees anything in the view. And that's why we make a reference to the API call that's getting, we subscribe to the result of the API call that is getting those locations, and we can make sure that that stuff is already set before the user sees anything. And so to take a look, we see some more functions down here, and these functions were referred to in our template, and that we were looking at a little bit earlier. And just to go back and show that, is that we see, okay, well, we see add location, and we see view location, which requires an index from that ng4 directive that we were talking about before. And this is where those functions are stored at. And the component functions don't necessarily handle any business logic, but mostly just user experience to kind of, like this one, view location is routing the user to somewhere if they click on a specific item of a table. Or add location is opening a modal that would handle saving a new location to the locations table. And if we need to make any API calls, we can just refer to the services in the constructor and just call those service calls or functions from using the constructor. So we don't have to have any of that business logic in the component.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here again, Gavin.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can kind of see this in action, what I was talking about, the relationship between this component class and the HTML. So Angular is really taking control of all of this web app. So you can see it has some router functionality there on view location. It's taking control of the routing and telling it what to load in when it sees that route. It's taking user clicks, and it's telling it, instead of doing normal behavior, call this function instead. It's taking HTML elements, and instead of just having static text in there, you're telling it bind it to this data instead. So this class really glues in all the data and into the template in a really nice way.
So it's an MVC model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Essentially, yeah. And to kind of show that in the code is, we have the model represented here as the locations, which we're using that model file of type location. And then we can just immediately refer to it because we have the template connected to our component here, like we do with the ng4. We can, now we know that we're working with a location class. So like I said, this is our demonstration project, but there's some things that could be added to this. And so for an example, if we go here, we can take a look at this first entry, and we know that this one has items because we saw that in the beginning. And then we go to the items page, and we see, okay, great. This page has the ability to add an item. We have this modal here that we can add a new item to this list. But let's go back and check out a different location and see, okay, well, I guess, the view item button isn't here. And let's take a look at as to why that's happening. We should be able to add an item here if there's no items to view. So that's going to be in the location component. And we're going to open that up real quick. And then we see, okay, here's the button that I was referring to for viewing in items. And if we take a look here, we see that there's another built-in Angular directive called ngIf, and this handles dynamically displaying and hiding elements on the DOM. And so it's based off of a Boolean expression. So if this has items value is true, then it knows to show this button. And let's take a look in the component as to where that's handling that. And we are setting that in another ng on init lifecycle hook block. We're making a call to get the location. And then from there, we're calling the item service to get items of the location ID. And then we're checking, is the result that we get back, is the length bigger than 0? And if it is, then we have items to display. If not, then we don't. But we don't have anything representing the false value here, so that the user has kind of a continuous, they can add an item if the location doesn't have an item yet. And so let's take a look in the component, and I think I saw it. And so yeah, we have an add item function already defined here that takes in a location ID and then just uses that item component. And so we want to make sure, okay, well, first we want to make sure that the items module is actually imported into our locations module. Like Aaron was talking about, we can just import these things if we want to reuse that code. And we see that here, the items module is already imported. So now it looks like we just have to make another button that uses the false value of has items and refers to the add item to use the add item modal to add an item if there is no previous items already associated with the location. And we can do that really easily. We can come down here and make another button element, and we type button, and then we're going to make another, we use the click directive referencing to the add item function. And we pass in the location ID just like we did for the go to items function below it. And then we can use the ngIf directive for the opposite value of has items. And then we're going to say this button is going to say add item. And we can save that and flip back over. Now we see the page that we were just looking at before now has an ability to add an item. And we can open that up, fill this form out, save it, and this is going to redirect us to the items table that we can see regarding this location. So that's it. That really highlights how powerful the modularity that Angular provides is as far as reusing this code. So we don't have to repeat ourselves. We don't have to make another modal in the locations folder. We can simply just import wherever the items module and then use this add item modal whenever we need it. And so another idea that you could potentially add to this is a session validation or a login feature for security. And that would kind of go into the ideas of public and private guards, but that's a little bit more in detail for Angular. That's all handled in the documentation you can look up. But just some ideas of what you could do in pagination potentially for the location tables as well. But that's it for me for the more technical aspect of the demo. I'm going to hand it back over to Aaron.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. So yeah, Gavin just showed you kind of the basics of how we build a web app with Thriftly API and using Angular. But a lot of the stuff he showed you does come with Angular out the gate. But there are some things that you have to build yourself. Whether it be modals or like Gavin was saying, pagination on a table or something, and that can take some time. But the great thing about the Angular ecosystem is it plays really well with others. So when I'm talking about third-party integrations here, and Gavin showed you that package.json file, and that's kind of the node package manager there, and you can bring in a lot of your dependencies there. And a lot of times these dependencies are going to be built with Angular in mind already. He mentioned ng Bootstrap. That takes Bootstrap stylings and functionality and kind of wraps it in Angular. So then all you have to do is treat that Bootstrap as an Angular module and just import it into your module, and then it's good to go. And we have a ton of functionality that we would have had to build ourselves otherwise. We can have modal support, we can have drop downs, things like that take a little bit of work otherwise. So works really great with third-party stuff there. Okay, I also wanted to talk a bit about some of the tools we're using here that don't have to do with Angular per se, but make your life a lot easier. So the text editor that Gavin's using here is VS Code, and this is the one that we highly recommend for everyone working on the front end, but it works really well with Angular specifically too. So VS Code lets you integrate Git into the text editor, so you can do version control. It allows you to bring in all kinds of extensions, whether they're built-in ones or custom ones that you can build. Lets you do syntax highlighting for Angular specific code. Lets you do linting, which can fix some syntax errors ahead of time so you don't run across those when you're actually testing it. It really has a lot of built-in stuff that makes developing quick and easy. You can host development servers through it, things like that. So I recommend checking out that text editor. It's completely free. It's the open source version of Visual Studio. So lots of history there for sure. The other thing I was going to talk about is the Chrome debugging tools. So most browsers have debugging tools, but we use Chrome a lot because it just kind of works the best for the most part. We like it. And it can do a lot of stuff for you when it comes to debugging, testing, and styling as well. So you can log and view things in the console. You can also look at your elements and inspect your whole DOM tree, delete certain elements, edit stylings in real time, change the fonts, do all kinds of things in there. You can also check out your actual JavaScript code in the sources tab, and you can set up debuggers and do a lot of testing there. You can do audits for your web app that will tell you some performance issues, some best practices you might not be implementing. maybe some SEO things you can do. You can look at all the network calls being made, whether it's bringing in fonts or doing actual API calls, bringing in CSS, things like that. So this debugging tool really lets you get behind the scenes with your entire app. So it's a good thing to get familiar with this, because if you're building a web app, you're most likely going to be using this a lot. This also supports extensions as well, by the way, so you can do Angular specific extensions, kind of view your app from an Angular perspective as well. All right, so last thing I want to talk about is mentioned in the beginning that there's a lot of other frameworks out there, and there are, whether it's Vue.js, there's React, which has become very popular. So I want to talk about why we decided to use Angular. I touched on it a bit in the beginning, but with Angular, there's really just a lot available, a lot of information, a lot of resources, a lot of plugins. A lot of people have done a lot of things in Angular. So a lot of times we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can come in, find a third-party plugin that does table support, find a third-party plugin that does modals, integrate it with our API, and we can get a really nice working app out of the gate pretty quickly. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have in the Angular department. I will pass it back to Oliver now.
Thank you, Aaron and Gavin, for kind of whetting our appetites there in relation to Angular. And so here, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Really, what Gavin and Aaron have shown you is just scratching the surface of what Angular can do. There are literally thousands of third-party modules. And as you saw in that configuration file in the package.json file that Gavin showed, Angular itself is actually made up of quite a few modules that way. It's a modularized framework itself. And so in some ways, it is its own third party for bringing those packages in there. And really, that's so that you can kind of pick and choose what features you want to use. There are a ton of other features in Angular. It's quite extensive from that standpoint, and it has this very rich ecosystem around it as well. One of the best features of Angular is the large number of developers available to build front ends against, for instance, a Thriftly API. There's no existing knowledge required from that Angular developer about Thriftly to be able to work on a Thriftly API. Gavin didn't need to know what programming language the API was written in, and for all he knows, it was written in multiple languages on the back end. Thriftly provides a unified interface from all of the supported languages, including Dataflex, Delphi, Java, and of course, multiple .NET languages. What this means is that your current application developers can transition into this API developer role very quickly, especially with how easy it is to use that built-in development server that's included with Thriftly's developer license, which of course is free. We know from experience that it's a great combination to get your application moved into a cloud or a hybrid cloud architecture quickly. We use it ourselves on consulting projects quite regularly. So that's some information about Thriftly. Like I said, we only scratched the surface, but we would like to open things up to a bit of Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or to ask a question in chat, and we'll try and answer that to the best of our abilities. And while you're doing that, actually, I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask of Aaron and Gavin as they were going through that presentation. Maybe they can clarify a couple of things.
Sure.
I noticed, I'm going to stop sharing so we can kind of see each other here. I noticed that you kind of showed some scripts related to building, and then when you were making changes in code, I saw it said compiling down at the bottom of the editor there. But I know JavaScript isn't a compiled language, of course, but so what's up with this compilation that's taking place? What exactly is being recompiled?
Yeah, so Gavin mentioned the Angular CLI, the command line interface. And that really handles a lot of that compilation and building. And it is built itself on what's called Webpack. And that is it's a JavaScript based, what would I call it? A process manager, I guess. And it can take these tasks and perform them in a very organized fashion. So it handles all that essentially, takes your code, builds it. It can build it for development, host it on a server like we were seeing there. That enables live reload. So as you change your code, it will update in the browser. You might have seen some of those things in action, but it can also build it for production. So it can optimize that code, get rid of all the code not being used, minify the code that is being used, and then get your code nice and ready for an actual production build. So it handled all of that, yeah.
So really there's a true difference here between when you're developing it and doing your debugging and all of that. It is a different deliverable than what you would deploy.
Exactly. Yep.
Gotcha. Now in that configuration file that Gavin showed, one of the things I noticed was these scripts at the top, and he went into them briefly, but there was like an ng build and a couple others in there, and it looked like one related to linting maybe or something like that. What are those scripts about?
Those scripts are provided, or the field in the package.json for scripts is, so sometimes when you build your project regarding Webpack and how it's handling all those assets and fonts and style sheets and whatnot, you might have a couple different node commands that you might need to run when building your project to get it ready to host on a staging server or something like that. So you can actually write all those node commands out in one line, but then have it referenced to just something simple like build. Or if you have like different brands that you're maybe building your code on, that you could refer to the specific brand so that you have node scripts that are running to handle that specific brand build process. So it takes a lot of those different node commands that you might need to run to start your server that you're running it on for development mode, and just kind of condenses it down into one nice easy command like start or build. And these ones here, I haven't messed with these at all. And so they're really simple, like ng serve, ng build. But normally in a production application, you would have a lot bigger node commands like that than that.
So right now they're simple and short and everything, but in a bigger application or one that's going into production, those could really start to save you some time when you're and even some knowledge in that regard as to what all you need to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have some build scripts here that we do for that can clone a Git repo. It can build the Git repo. You can run bash scripts in there and then actually deploy your repo. So it's not just even within Angular and Node. You can actually create bash scripts and run them through there and stuff too. So you can get pretty complex if you want.
Gotcha. Okay. And then one of the things that I just wanted to point out when Aaron was talking about the services there and that core service that's using JSONRPC, it actually is pretty neat that he could just take that core service, if I understand it right, Aaron, you could take that core service and replace it with a different one that's making a SOAP call or a REST call, and the interface to the rest of the application would remain the same. All you'd have to change is that core service, right?
Yeah, exactly. Nothing else has to change. You continue to call the core service. It's just now the core service uses SOAP instead of JSONRPC, and it's all handled in there.
Gotcha. So yeah, you have a lot of power that way then to use whatever happens to be best, even for a specific call. You could make multiple services available, and some calls may work best if they're using a binary service, for instance, Apache Thrift or something like that. You could mix and match that way, I would think.
Totally. You can have 8 different APIs you're using with different services. You can have one API using different protocols. There's a lot of flexibility there and a lot of reusability.
Yeah, well, that's pretty neat. Well, we are going to have a video of this webinar up soon, along with a copy of the slides. And the reason you may be interested in getting a copy of the slides is that we have this list of resources that can help you get started with Angular and Thriftly, including a more complete version of this Angular application that Gavin was showing here. We've got a Git repo that you're able to pull down to use the exact same one that Gavin had here, along with a more complete version of that application, along with some links to some of the other tools that we mentioned here, and a nice tutorial on getting started with Angular that'll actually take you step by step through starting your first Angular web application. Now, before we go today, there's one last thing I'd like to do. I'd like to give you a little preview of what's coming up in part 3 of this series. We have it scheduled for June 18th at 11 a.m. And we'll be showing how to use this same API, the same property tracker API, which is included with our developer license, our developer install there. We're going to show how to build a React native mobile front end for iOS and Android. And we look forward to that presentation, which is going to be by another one of our developers, AJ Singh. And until then, thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a pleasant day.